Hi, my name is Raphael Sparge.
And I'm Greg Lumley.
And welcome to another episode of Inside the Arthouse. Today, we're here with a new film called Stripped for Parts with director Rick Goldsmith, Oscar nominated twice and recipient of the Peabody Award, amongst many others. And his new film, Stripped for Parts, is opening imminently, I guess this coming week.
Yep, Stripped for Parts is going to be opening October 4th at the Royal Theatre, which is where we're shooting this. And Rick is going to be here on Saturday, October 5th, for Q&A following the Twilight and evening shows. But the film is also going to be playing at theaters around the country. And it's a really important film, especially one that needs to be seen right now.
Let's take a moment and watch this trailer from Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink.
Tomorrow will be the final edition of the Rocky Mountain News.
The last decade and a half, we've seen 1,800 newspapers disappear.
The Denver Post isn't dying. The Denver Post is being murdered.
The media is a food chain which would fall apart without local newspapers.
We've been hearing for the last decade or so that newspapers are dying, they're dinosaurs because of the internet. There's this bigger problem. There's an industry that's out to destroy newspapers and doing it deliberately.
Distressed investing is called vulture investing for a reason. They're feeding on a carcass of a company. They want to get in, make some money, and get out.
What hedge funds will tell you is this is creative destruction in capitalism.
We got bought by this mysterious company. Nobody even knew who they were. It was called Alden Global Capital, and it was a New York hedge fund. I said, you're an investigative reporter. Why don't you dig into Alden and just write about who they are and what they're doing, because people don't know.
I work for the bad guys. Now, when did that happen? When did I start working with the bad guys?
The Denver Post has launched a revolt against its owner, New York-based hedge fund Alden Global Capital.
A guy named Chuck Plunkett just decided he'd had enough.
It's either stand up and speak up now or write your own obituary in 2 or 3 years.
It's one of the most courageous things I've ever witnessed in a 40-year career in journalism.
We know from copious research that when a community loses a newspaper, voter participation goes down, corruption goes up.
There is misinformation out there. Communities are misinformed and uninformed, and that's really dangerous.
Somebody's got to cover the story to argue for the sanctity of facts and truth.
There are times in your life when you are thrust into a situation where are you going to stand up and risk everything, or are you going to back down?
Newspapers are not just any other business. They are the only private industry specifically named in the Bill of Rights.
History will not judge us kindly. If one day we wake up to realize we failed to protect our community's right to know, and in turn, our very democracy.
Yeah, Rick, I was, in reading about, you and the focus of many of the docs that you've done, that they have been focused on journalism and journalism in general, and I guess what do you think has sort of been what has been the what got you there? What is the fire that burns in you about journalism to make these movies?
Yeah, it really started when I was a kid. I mean, I used to go out and get the newspaper off the front stoop when I was 7 years old and come in and read the sports section while I was eating breakfast. I think I knew from a very young age that this was something that was connecting me to the outside world. It was connecting me to my community, but it was connecting me to the great events that were happening as I was growing up. And I never lost that passion for newspapers. And when I became a documentary filmmaker, which was about 40 years ago, I was drawn to films about journalism. So this is my third one now. It's like a trilogy. And the first one I did, Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press, was about a muckraking journalist who was a press critic. So he was both a dedicated newsman himself, but a fierce critic of the advertising and the censorship and the catering to big business. And that was my entree into feature documentary filmmaking. So bring that forward 20, 30 years, and I'm still reading the newspapers, and now we're talking about 2018. But they're getting smaller and smaller. And I knew this was not a good time for newspapers. I knew that the economic forces were not in the newspaper's favor. But what I didn't know until I read an article online about a rebellion in Denver in the spring of 2018 by the newspaper men and women against their owner. And their owner was a hedge fund. And the principals of the hedge fund couldn't care less about journalism, but they saw distressed asset. Industry, a distressed asset. They saw a distressed company, and what they specialized in was distressed asset investing. And that's how they made their money. So that's part of the film. And, that's maybe a complicated word, but we go into that in the film. And what comes out of this film is the newspaper men and women themselves, who in general never report on their own profession or their own industry, were now not only reporting the story, but they were the story.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not a journalist. I didn't study journalism, but I think the idea of trying to remove yourself from the story, to be impassioned, to tell the truth, is baked in at some level to the best of journalism. And conscientious journalists, therefore, would not want to do that, become the story. And yet they can't not be in this kind of in this situation. They're forced to, they're forced into this because who is going to tell that story if they don't?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so a number of them, and these are the ones that we focus on in the film, they're like the canaries in the coal mine. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening to local journalism in America. And we're going to tell you why. We're going to tell you what's behind it, and we're going to maybe inspire you to do something about it.
It's an incredibly well-structured documentary. It's really well made, and you narrate it. You obviously take us through it. How long were you making it? And when you started it, did you know where you were headed? Was it something that kind of evolved as you continued to work on it? Or was it sort of kind of minted in your mind and you were just now going to go get it?
When I first got into it, what attracted me were the questions that were raised in that first story I read about what was going on. So here was this outfit that was wrecking local journalism, essentially. And that was the headline of the article. If Alden Global Capital is wrecking local journalism and they don't intend to stop soon. Something like that. And so I'm intrigued. Wait, does an outfit intentionally wrecking local journalism? That seemed odd to me. Why would you try to wreck journalism to make money rather than to practice journalism? And then it was the journalists who were fighting back, and they were challenging the people who were owning their paper, and they were risking their careers, risking their jobs, risking their careers to tell a story that might get them at hot water. But they knew this band of journalists, several different journalists from different papers and coming at it from different points of view, knew that it was an important story. And if they didn't cover it, the community wouldn't know. And they were so dedicated to get the important news to their community that they, broke some tenets of journalism like don't report on yourselves, and they went after it.
And when you talk about, this is where the story's going. Just today, I opened up the paper and read about a strike being authorized by the writers at the Los Angeles Daily News and the Orange County Register. Interestingly enough, two papers owned by a subsidiary of Alden Global Capital. So this is it's happening. It's happening here in Los Angeles. It's not just small communities. This is, second largest city in the country. That's being impacted by, what's happening here.
So here's the thing, right? So basically, those of us who read the newspaper, who still like reading the newspaper, or who generationally obviously grew up with the newspaper, compared to maybe younger people who don't. I live in New York. It used to be everyone would sit on the subway and read, and they would have that wonderful way of folding so that you didn't intrude on someone else's space. And it was sort of an art form, and they're gone. Everyone is lit up with the light of the phone on the phone, and the little kiosks, of course, that sell gum and papers. Most of those are gone or going. And so if you're a younger person, why should I care about newspapers? Of course, would bubble up, and what you factor in, which is what I appreciate so much, is not just the tradition of it, or hey, this newspaper's been around for 200 years, but that these are essentially the backbones of democracy. This is a strong journalistic presence amidst our leaders, and locally and nationally, is what holds us all to account. And without that, the opportunity for things to jump the rails are just the odds go way up.
It is a much larger issue, and you started your question by talking about the younger generation and why should they care about newspapers. Newspapers were a perfect vehicle for journalism for 150 or 200 years in this country. They were funded by advertisers, so they had big newsrooms. They could cover their entire community. They could send foreign correspondents overseas to cover the great events in Europe and all over the world. But it's not so much people should care about newspapers now, because the end is in sight for newspapers. But the end is not in sight for journalism, and it can't be in sight for this cannot be the end of journalism. Because if we don't have journalism, especially local journalism, we don't have democracy, because people need the information and the opinion and the news of what's going on around them to make informed decisions. It may sound like a civics lesson, but it's true. And I think some of the maybe crumbling of our democratic process is due to the decline of local journalism. So why should people care? There's really no alternative. And one of the things that we do in the film is we not only talk about what Alden Global Capital is doing to destroy local journalism, and we not only talk about what journalists are doing to fight back against that decline. We're looking at the openings at the new news organizations, the digital startups, the
non-for-profit model, yeah.
The non-for-profit. And there is, with every, door closed, there's a window that's opened. And the window that's open here is public service journalism. True public service journalism may be more available to us in the future than it was in the past, because newspapers were generally a for-profit venture. They tended not to cover poor people. They tended not to cover people of color. They tended not to cover the voices or the concerns of the people that were below, let's say, the upper middle class. And now with these new organizations, which we also focus on in the film, you see more opportunity for really covering the local communities. And there's maybe more of a partnership and an interdependent relationship between the community and the journalists than there was ever before. And to me, that's the hope of the future. How's it going to play out? Those questions are tough because what the news organizations, the legacy news organizations, the great newspapers of the past had was they had heft, and they could take on the corporate, the big money, the big power in their communities, their cities, their rural communities. And for the smaller news organizations, that's a bigger lift for them.
Yeah.
Even just to have the legal team to be able to kind of support the.
Well, certainly if you're doing if you're doing investigative journalism and you're going after somebody, you've got some real issues. I mean, you could argue that these news organizations, because they're not reliant on advertising, are in fact better able, potentially to cover these stories because they don't have to worry about the risk of losing advertisers. But you're right. I mean, it takes money to run those organizations. It takes professionals who know their stuff. I'm trying to be hopeful here. But look, I mean, it's a fight. Part of the reason why I find this film so important, it's a fight for us coming out of the pandemic. I mean, pre-pandemic, the LA Times had a staff of film critics. And if your film was playing in Los Angeles for a week, you could pretty much rely that it was going to get reviewed and that on the Friday opening day, there would be a newspaper that went to people's homes and they would leaf through that newspaper and they would discover films because, all the reviews would be there and you might find a film that you hadn't heard about and you would decide, I'm going to go see that movie. And, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I don't know if your film's going to get reviewed by the LA Times. I certainly don't know if it's going to, be in the print edition, and it probably won't be on Friday. And we've had films that have played that they eventually get run in the print edition, Tuesday or Wednesday after opening, and the film's ending on Thursday. So that whole, it's a major impact on, bringing the art house cinema back because these smaller films don't have the ad budgets. The Hollywood films, they can find another way to connect with audiences, in advance of opening. You don't get that review, you're at a disadvantage.
Well, absolutely true. I think that what the newspapers provided for the community is vast because you had, you had people, you had the high school sports teams playing on Friday night, and you could read about it on Saturday morning. Right. Even your local baseball teams, if the Dodgers are playing on Wednesday night, it's not even in the paper until Friday. Yeah. So, because of they've shifted all. Yeah, everything's ending earlier now. The deadline the news deadline for the reporters is so much earlier now. So, and you're right, the arts and the obits. And the, so many different things were packaged into newspapers. And that was the beauty of newspapers. So we're losing that, and that will be lost. I think the heart of what newspapers did was when they were at their best, they presented good quality journalism, and they let you know what was happening in your community as well as in the larger world.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we have a villain here, which is Alden Global Capital, but I think there's probably a bigger picture, and there's also a level where we need to start looking in the mirror at some of this. Do we? You close with a paraphrase of the Ben Franklin quote. About a republic if you can keep it. But, where are we in this picture? And what can we do to, if not save what used to work, contribute and create what will be the future?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. First of all, you can educate yourself because there are news organizations now that you can, subscribe to your local public radio stations. You can get the new startups. There's probably 2 or 3 or 4 in your town already, and subscribe to them. Keep yourself informed. Subscribe to the legacy paper if it's a good paper. That's one thing, is just staying involved and making sure that you understand that you knowing about the greater world around you is important. You just mentioned that newspapers in your town are going on strike. Well, who's going on strike? Those are people in the News Guild. They're union members, and they're the ones that are bringing the news to you. They need your support. So listen to them, listen to the issues that they care about, plug in and see if you can support the strike, see if you can support the strikers. There's legislation that is now building in every state. In California, there was some new legislation that was just passed a few weeks ago. Keep yourself up to date on that. And where there's room to get involved in the public forum, get involved. These things are happening all around us on various fronts. And I think it's important for us as a community to see how important journalism is. It used to be that journalism took care of itself because the newspapers financially could take care of themselves. That's not true anymore. But that's not true for a lot of things in our society. We pay for public schools. We pay for the military. We pay for the police. We pay for firefighters. Why not pay for journalism? If it can't be a profit-making enterprise, maybe it's up to us to find ways so that it has the financial resources to be vibrant and robust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the movie is, I want to say the foreground is journalism and these newspapers, and obviously this extraordinary story that you've uncovered or that you discovered that really is sort of shocking and horrifying. That's the foreground. The background on this is really just how our democracy works, right? So, and that's really kind of what's at stake, and that's what really, I think, again, just grounds what you're doing. I mean, I was so moved by the reporters who said, I would write a story, and I know I've changed laws, and I know I've been able to kind of elevate. I've been able to save lives,
free people from prison,
right? And so these are reporters who were paid, obviously, that this is their job to lean in and discover. And try and bring attention to issues that people aren't aware of. The question, of course, is how does a newsroom sustain itself with a smaller nonprofit? I mean, obviously, you've just got less of less. You've got less, less ink, as it were. I mean, virtual ink. You've got less attention spans. You've got smaller crews of people and smaller support staffs for those people. So that's again, just by the diminished numbers, it's already wounded, I guess.
Well, one of the things that comes out of the film that was my purpose, not just to expose Alden Global Capital, which I think the people in the film were doing so well, was to show journalism at work. So at the very heart of the film, you see one journalist, Julie Reynolds, who has been, who was investigating Alden Global Capital 2 years before I came on the scene, and did it for 7 years total, and churned out over 100 articles. And you get a feel for what investigative reporting is all about. Some of it's dull. It's going through records. It's, being persistent. But it's kind of fun watching Julie Reynolds practice this craft of investigative reporting. And then you see other reporters just going about their own day on the street,
on the beat.
And the one guy, Tom Peel, you see him. He's covering a courthouse. He's covering, a new law about how police need to own up, need to be accountable for their misdeeds. And this representative of the police union is arguing before the court why, no, you shouldn't really cover us that closely. And then you see him writing up his story with a younger reporter. And the interplay of the two of them putting together a story. They have a deadline, trying to get the right quotes, trying to put it together, submitting the story, waiting around. It's like the documentary version of All the President's Men or Spotlight. And that was kind of my intention from the start.
No, it plays
to give
that way
the audience a feel for what these people do every day.
And yet it's sobering to look at, this is what a newsroom is today. And thinking back to, the class of Park Row or whatever, where they're sitting there typing away at their news and then handing it to somebody who's running it and the editor, and then getting, and it's, the lack of resources. And yet the great work that's still done, even in the face of that, just by, people who are committed and knowledgeable and understand, this job that they're doing.
People ask me often, what about the young people that might go to journalism school? What are their job prospects when they come out? And I don't have a great answer to that because I know the job market for journalists is shrinking. But what I do know is there's something like a journalism gene, and maybe that gene lives in 5% of the population.
Arguably
and
less,
because
but yeah.
and because it's a gene, it persists in every generation. And what I've found is from people who teach journalism to young people, but it's speaking to young journalists myself as well, is there's no shortage of people who want to do this and will do this for a living, will dig into what's going on around them, will not take what's presented to them. They take what's presented to them on face value, and then they dig into it. They're going to do it. And this generation's people who have that gene, they're going to do it as much as the last generation.
Yeah.
And that gives me hope as well, because they're also going to be the ones who figure it out, who figure out how to make this journalistic tradition endure through their generation and through their children's generation.
Yeah. And the journalistic tradition that you're talking about is essentially holding people accountable, or what would you say that is? I mean, what is
I'm going to go a step further and say it's not now that I'm thinking about this is a prophetic tradition at some level. I mean, what are, if we, maybe you don't like going into that realm, but I mean, what did the prophets do? They turned an eye onto their society and exposed the flaws. Which then becomes, at some level, once the means of communicating that, through the written word, through the printed word, become newspaper, become journalism.
They do. They expose the flaws. They expose the abuses that people in power are doing. And even more than that, what they do is we have events that happen. There's a hurricane hitting Florida right now. There's fires in your community. There's a murder that takes place. And there's a company that's polluting the waters next door. How do you put that into context? I mean, if you just watch, say, a TV news report and they have a clip of 30 seconds of blah, 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 maybe they try to put it into context, but come on. It's TV news. If it bleeds, it leads, right?
That's right. Yep.
But the good journalism puts what's happening around us into context so we can make sense of it and then hopefully make decisions about what needs to happen through legislation, what needs to happen through just community work, You see a homeless encampment in your town, living under a bridge or whatever. What does that mean? For a lot of people, that means I don't want to see these people there. I don't. It's a bother. To other people, it's like these people are on the rocks. Yeah, these people have hit the skids, and we're not really taking care of them. We're not, as you said before, attention must be paid. So it's a good journalist who can take a problem in society and have it make sense to a broad community out there so that we can do the right thing about it.
Well, you've made 3 movies about journalism, and I guess you've decided not to be a journalist, but you have essentially, you clearly have, as you say, the journalism gene, because what you've done with this movie is just that. You've essentially, opened and exposed something, and in so doing, then you really kind of elicit kind of a powerful response of like, oh my God, what can we do? Which was what Greg was asking, what can we do? I hear you when you say like, there may be no saving newspapers, but that maybe what we're looking at is preserving journalism. That's sort of essentially what you're saying. Is that correct?
I would say so. It doesn't matter, as Julie Reynolds says in the film, it can be on the paper or it can be on your cell phone, but there has to be a good, solid professional news organization behind it to make it work. And the organizations are made up of those writers, reporters, editors, photojournalists who bring us the news, and when they're at their best, make it alive, make it exciting, and make people care. That's the other part of it, right, that I think is important. That without journalism, you don't have people caring as much about what's going wrong with society, about why there are so many people living on the street, about why housing isn't being built, about why there's pollution more than there should be, all the things.
I have a cousin who just graduated from Georgetown as a photojournalist, and we just had dinner a couple of months ago, and I remember sort of vaguely thinking, God, where do you go? Like, what are you going to do? No, she's got a wonderful job in Chicago, and I'm thrilled that that's happening. But as you say, clearly there's something in someone who wants to be a journalist, which is essentially about their caring, and then about wanting to extend that caring to others, essentially to create, empathy and or awareness, so that then choices and or hearts and minds can be affected. But that comes, at least initially, from this deeper instinct inside that journalist, whether it be photo or written, to care and to care deeply, and then to learn how to translate that. It's such a wonderful and important human element, and also why I love film, because it affects you and touches your heart and makes you care.
Yeah, I want to say a few more words about the villains, as you call them, Alden Global Capital, and what's happening out there. I think as a society, we have kind of ceded, in a way, CEDED, the power to run our institutions more and more to, big business, to Wall Street. And it's not just newspapers that are suffering. Medical care, prisons, nursing care, mobile homes, they're all being swallowed up by these vultures, in a way. And one by one, industries have given themselves over to the big money. And it makes people more divorced from their own lives. Everybody goes to work. You go to work for 40 hours a week. You want to be plugged in. You want to have a say in whatever it is that you work at. And what we're seeing is private equity is owning more and more of what we do. It's more and more remote as opposed to local ownership. And it makes people disconnected, I would say, from the world around them.
Well, obviously, you're not going to find me arguing against local ownership and family ownership. But yeah, I think the rules of the game are, favor these guys that ultimately don't own or don't have any skin in the game anymore because they've been able to strip it all out through debt financing or all kinds of other things. And they have no love for what they're nominally doing. Their love is just making money. And by commodifying everything, we've made it easier for them to acquire something, leverage it to the hilt, put that leveraged money directly into their pockets, and then say, oh my God, this business doesn't make money. It's like, no, this business makes money. You've just, structured it now where it can't, succeed. And then that leads to the perception, oh, newspapers are dead. Well, no, newspapers are not dying. You killed it. You absolutely killed it. And, and look, I blame Silicon Valley for some of these things. I mean, this mantra of, move fast and break things. Does anybody stop to think what they're breaking?
Well, I think that we tend to forget that we, the people, really do have the power to decide what goes on in our community. So if there's private equity owning newspapers, hedge funds owning newspapers, we can construct legislation that will limit that. We can use existing antitrust laws to prevent this massive takeover. More than half of the newspapers in this country are owned by hedge funds or private equity.
Oh my God.
Now,
that's wild.
So it's up to us to be able to say, no, that's not okay. That's not okay for journalism. That's not okay for the news organizations who are responsible to bring that journalism to the people.
Is that
and then we have, of course, obviously our private responsibility to spend our dollars with responsible organizations, locally owned organizations that are actually doing good work. That we can support those groups, and I think the film points at that. So legislation is certainly key, but we have, even beyond that, we have the ability to do things.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, it's a tough story. Obviously, you went into a tough story knowing that it was tough and then found more tough stuff. How did you keep your chin up, I guess? I don't know how to say it any better.
Well, it was interesting because I got into the story in the spring of 2018, and I realized that the common wisdom around the industry was that these hedge fund owners were going to gobble up the newspapers, and within 3 years they were going to have made their money, and then they were going to shut them down. And that's not what happened. Now, partly it was because of COVID, but what happened was these hedge funds, Alden Global Capital in particular, but hedge funds in general, found that they not only could make money off the top, which was, they buy on the cheap, sell the buildings, make their money back that way, and then lay off a good portion of the staff. But they found that they could actually they could make money continuously. And what I saw after I got into it in the spring of 2018 was within 9 months, Alden Global Capital was going after Gannett, which was the biggest publicly owned newspaper chain in the country, and trying to get Gannett. And another year later, they went after the Tribune Company. So just as we started to get into editing the film and wrapped up this story, some big new event would happen. And we needed to follow that event because the story wasn't over. At a certain point, we had to say, okay, we've got to wrap up the film. But it was 5.5 years working on the film. And then we finally put it to bed. And major events that you see in the film happened while we were doing the filming. And we followed those and the people who were involved on one side or the other.
Can you talk a little bit about, it's not addressed in the film, but specifically, but the impact of COVID on local journalism, on local newspapers?
Well, it was many. I think one of the biggest impacts that I see now, still visiting newsrooms, is that it essentially didn't destroy, but almost took a step in destroying the workplace of the newspaper. You used to have, if you had a big city newspaper, 400 employees. And if you had a mid-sized newspaper, it might have been 150 or 200 employees. Well, as these hedge funds took over, those numbers shrunk, by, say, 30, 40, 50%. When COVID hit, people were still reporting, but they were reporting from home.
Right, remote.
And now that COVID, it's still with us, but the COVID emergency is over. Those people aren't all back at the newsroom. Newsrooms are quieter places now. Yeah. And you don't get that camaraderie. You don't get that interchange of inquiring minds, shooting the shit with each other and trying to figure out what to do on a story face to face. You may still have them talking on the phone or whatever. But I think that the biggest change that COVID has had vis-a-vis newspapers has been on the actual newsroom itself and the construction of that workplace. And I think we
reclaiming the value of that for people that say, well, it's kind of convenient to not go into this.
Yeah, everybody likes it. Oh, yeah. I mean, you hear it everywhere in every profession. Oh, yeah, I work from home 2 days a week and go in 3 days a week, or vice versa. And there's something to be said for that.
Well, you're not going to get me to argue with that.
but there's something lost as well.
Yeah.
Right. And also, and that scene that you talked about with the older and the younger journalist, there is something that's so clear with a senior journalist where they have, a lifetime of situational awareness in terms of how to, what the move is and how to be able to deal with, an irate mayor or, police chief or whatever. And that is not necessarily something that you learn in journalism school or that you learn, your first day out. That's years and years and years. So that is another, just a giant loss, obviously, is dealing with the kind of the elders, as it were.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned while I was making the film, when you dive into how the hedge funds dismantle a paper, when they go in and their first thing is to sell a building, then they're going to go over the staff. Inevitably, what they do is they offer buyouts to the most senior reporters.
Right.
So that saves them more money because they're the higher salaried reporters. But what it does to the newsroom is, as you mentioned, it takes away the institutional knowledge of the newsroom.
Right.
So you have these people who have been on the job for 20, 30, 40 years, and they know their Rolodex, if that is still a word, their Rolodex is filled with people who they can go to find out about City Hall, to find out about this corporation that's kind of taken over things, to find out about the crooks in town. The younger reporters don't know that, but typically, over generations, they've learned that at the knee of the older reporters. That's going away.
So I guess my question is, I know you've worked on this for 5 years. You're now launching
for 25 years, or
right.
40 years.
Well, you've obviously done a lot of films about journalism, but this very specific kind of moment and this specific story as relates to kind of this hedge fund kind of takeover, as it were. Has it been digested yet by legislators, or have you had any response essentially from people who could essentially help make it a little easier for newspapers? Is there, because there should be a political kind of a boom, and your film really kind of tees it up pretty well to do so.
Well, the film is playing around the country, often with groups that are concerned with the decline in local journalism. So the screenings themselves, I was just on a panel with a state senator from California who had been working on a bill that was kind of folded into some other legislation, as it turns out, just a few weeks ago, about a month ago. And it was a great interchange because he gave the background of what he was doing behind the scenes. And, the two of us talked on the panel and with the audience about what was going on now in this new time of reduced resources for journalism in California. So the film has fed into the discussions, the public discussions that we've had. We are talking with legislators about it. We're talking with people who are working in organizations. There's one called Rebuild Local News. It's like a national organization that is paying attention to what can be done on a legislative level and on a community level.
That's great.
Whether it's in, Wisconsin or Minnesota or New York or California. So it's our impact campaign, if you will, is very vibrant right now. And we are trying to work hand in glove with the people who are most active in preserving, revitalizing, and rebuilding local journalism.
Clearly you've made a movie about America and American newspapers, but it's not just an American story. This is an international story because I'm certain there's some similar things happening in other countries as well. Has any other country essentially figured out some kind of a legislative or I don't know, some sort of outside-the-box ways in which to begin to sort of address this? One has to be creative, obviously, because it's a huge problem.
Right.
But is there any other solutions elsewhere that you've seen?
Well, let me compare and contrast what happened in California recently and what happens in Canada. California put together through a couple of different pieces of legislation and then in the end kind of a backroom deal, how to get money from Silicon Valley, which had basically been profiting off of newspapers, through the advertising and through, what they do best, which is turning high tech and changing times into profit, to get them to pay tax, if you will, into the journalism of their country. Oh. The deal that came about in California would be probably too complicated for me to even begin to unpack here. But it was a similar deal to what had been done in Canada within the last year or two. The difference being that the amount of money that the Canadian newspaper industry and journalism industry got from their own version of Silicon Valley was vastly higher than what could be done in California. And the shame of that was because there was a last-minute backroom deal, that California, often being a bellwether, was maybe now setting an example, and not the best example, for what could be done in other states. I would say that the California deal was a small step forward, but not what it could have been and not what it should have been.
Yeah.
And if that's the kind of small steps forwards it's going to take place around the country, And that's not going to be to our benefit.
Well, again, I mean,
we spend.
Yeah, if you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just one last thing. We spend, the United States spends so much less on journalism through the public till than almost any of the more developed countries in the world. Europe, Japan, Canada. And it's a shame. And even now, the idea of public funding for journalism, which, again, we address in the film, is one that's controversial in journalism circles. You know, we're the ones reporting on government.
Right.
So
shouldn't have your hand out, as it were.
How can we take money from the public till? Well, the answer is not so easy, but I will say that looking towards public funding of journalism has been opened up more than ever before. And it's on the table now, where it wasn't on the table 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah,
that's great.
Except that funding is constantly, on the chopping block potentially. How many times have we heard we're going to cut funding to NPR? We're going to cut funding to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Right.
This may be a separate question, and we'll either edit it in or not. But you talk about Thomas Paine in the film and the important role that common sense played in the formation of our country. How is Thomas Paine different from just a random blogger today? And how are they similar?
Well, I think what Thomas Paine did, that pamphlet, Common Sense, that we tend to forget or maybe never learned in our 7th grade social studies class, how big a role that pamphlet, it got, and this is without, transportation networks, it got to an enormous percentage of the populace. And it fired up the people to say, wait a second, what is happening from the British, and how we're being oppressed by the British is serious business. And it helped people take up arms. I mean, it really, and Thomas Paine's work and the work of other writers of that time fed the construction of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And it was the written word that was really so important back then. And again, we covered this in the film. In 1792, a Postal Act was passed by Congress so that everybody in the country could get the news, get their news and opinion in written form without regard to ability to pay. And so people were informed, and the government helped them become informed. And that was a model that once the advertising model took hold in this country kind of went away.
Right.
And I think only now are we beginning to understand that maybe we need that consciousness again, that it needs to be a community effort to preserve and reinvent journalism.
So challenged. I mean, you don't walk clearly into this political cycle on accident, but with the timing of the release of the film, but with kind of the word, the two words "fake news" being kind of almost, and every other sentence utterance, from certain candidates, there is, it's really an uphill challenge to really kind of explain what a true journalistic sensibility is. But
also for our country to really talk about the importance role of journalism and the media. And the media, look, there's bad news. I get that, or mistakes can be made. But anyway.
I want to comment on that. I mean, the phrase "the enemy of the people," that is a dangerous phrase, and it has led directly to reporters being physically attacked, and it's led to, I think, a diminution of the journalism vehicle and journalists themselves being valued in our society, and they are to be valued. And the good journalists, we owe a debt to them rather than trying to slander them. There's always going to be journalism that you disagree with. But that's kind of the point. The point that the founding fathers saw was it's only by having this exchange of different opinions and different points of view that we're going to get to the right solutions. So to pin that kind of villain label on journalists, enemies of the people, that's a horrible thing. And in other countries, it's even worse. That journalists have been killed, intentionally killed by powers that be.
Right.
So
yeah,
we
but
need
it's
to do a better job.
That the public starts seeing, I mean, how do you go from All the President's Men, to Die Hard, where as horrible as the terrorists are, at least they're cool, and the villain of the film at some level is the journalist.
Yeah. Well, maybe this will help. Maybe this film will help. Help move it to the other direction.
Rick,
help swing the pendulum back
to the degree that we can. And again, I sort of said this prior to you coming on, is just that we really want to do our part to try and help kind of ring the bell. I mean, you've made a wonderful film. You've really, I think it is not just a really well-crafted film and a well-structured film. You're a really good filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. Oh, it's so clear. We're with you every moment, but you ring the bell. You ring the bell, and by ringing the bell, you hopefully then kind of provide a kind of call to action just by virtue of kind of the clear landscape that you leave behind you. So that's why Greg came to me and said, look, we really want to let's talk to Rick if we can, to sort of try and get a chance to be able to kind of really let people know, because it's an important film for people to see.
If we can get just a few more people to come
well,
out and see this film.
I think one of the things that you'd see that jumped out at me while I was doing the film is how spirited and passionate, funny, dedicated these people are, who are the journalists that I found. They opened up themselves to me. I'm thankful for that. But it's fun to be with them for an hour and a half.
Yeah, smart people who've got a sense of humor. There's nothing better, right? That's just fantastic.
Hey, Rick, I'm curious. What are some of your favorite films about media, especially about journalists?
Well, I named my top two, which is All the President's Men and Spotlight. Deadline USA, an old film with Humphrey Bogart, where a newspaper, much like the newspapers today, was being bought out, and they were having to close down. And through the script of the film, you see the kind of work that these newspapers, they have a subplot going down. So that's a great one. There's one with Jimmy Stewart. It's got numbers in the title. I can't.
Northside 777, right?
Yeah, there we go. There we go.
Oh, very good.
Another great one.
I've never seen that one.
Another great one. Ace in the Hole with Kirk Douglas.
Yeah.
Jesus, I mean, there's a reason.
Front Page.
Front Page and My Girl Friday. Yeah, I thought that My Girl Friday was the Front Page. I guess there's been 2 or 3 versions of that, and My Girl Friday is essentially the same one, classic. But there's a reason why getting inside the newsroom and chasing a story is so much fun and so cinematic and so prone to having a story written about it, because it's juice. Yeah. It's the kind of juice that we eat up. So
what about some of the times where Hollywood gets it wrong, though? Any movies where you look at it and say, "Oh my God, that just is not
on newspapers"? No, but I'll mention one film that we tried to work into. We worked into our own film in earlier cuts, but decided it was a little too hokey. It's called City of Chance, and the central character is an investigative reporter named Julie Reynolds.
Oh.
And that's the name of the reporter, our reporter. So we cut in some clips from that film, but in the end, I guess it
didn't quite work. Okay.
Cutting room floor. But if you get a chance, City of Chance is the name of that film, 1940, I think.
That's great. Well, so Rick, just so people know how to find you, this film is opening in New York. It's opening in Los Angeles. We know that.
Yes.
Where else is it opening, and how can they find the film?
How they can find the film is, so we are playing at any given month, we're playing at different places all around the country. Next month, we're going to be in Pennsylvania. We're going to be in Maine. We're going to be back in the Bay Area because we've already shown there. We're going to have return visits, couple of screenings in the Bay Area. stripped4partsfilm.com is where you can, that's our website, stripped4partsfilm.com. And we have an updated schedule, that we keep
where it's
live.
going to be screening, where you're going to be appearing with the film and so on and so forth.
That's right. And I'll be appearing at the Laemmle Royal Saturday, October 5th.
Yeah.
4 and 7 o'clock show.
Right. Well, don't despair if you can't see Rick there, because hopefully there'll be other opportunities. Self-distribution is ultimately distribution. And you know how to do that part of things, to take off that filmmaker hat and put on the film seller hat, I know. So
absolutely.
And yeah, whether the film's playing for a week or just playing for a night, it's still an opportunity to see it. And frankly, ideally, when you do see it in a movie theater, to engage with other people in your community and discuss, what you can do to support those organizations that have replaced, that paper that was shut down, by Alden Global Capital.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, this is an issue that's being faced by every community in America. How to maintain and how to improve local journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really something.
Thank you so much for making the film, and thank you for joining us here inside the Arthouse.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.